Okay, and so the day that we've known is going to be coming for a while now has come. Supreme Court with Dobbs' decision has basically struck down Roe v. Wade, and it has massive implications here for the state of Kansas. First, just kind of when you first heard the news today, kind of what was the thoughts that were going through your head?
Well, so obviously, like pretty much everybody who pays attention to the news, I was familiar with the leaked decision back in May. I was familiar enough with the operations of the Supreme Court and with all of the work that has gone on for years, for decades, to shape the narrative around the Supreme Court, that any major change in the leaked decision would have been a surprise to me. Since there wasn't a major change, that wasn't a surprise. But what I did feel was the historical weight of this decision. As I was saying before, depending on how you define civil rights, depending upon how you understand the ability of citizens to claim rights, the Supreme Court with this decision has done something that it hasn't done since the notorious Dred Scott v. Sanford decision before the Civil War. In that decision, the Supreme Court said, actually, free blacks, African Americans, do not have the rights that they claim to have. And here, the Supreme Court is saying that women do not have the rights that for 50 years they have been claiming to have. And obviously, like I said, there's different ways in which you can describe that. You could talk about, well, what about the rights of, the fetus or the unborn person? There's different ways in which you could construe these things. But fundamentally, Roe v. Wade guaranteed a right. This decision takes that right away. And the Supreme Court has not done something like that in over a century.
Yeah. And it now kicks the decision to the states.
Right.
We've already seen trigger bills in several states that either have already probably kicked in by this point or will be within the next week or so. Here in Kansas, surprisingly for a red state, constitutionally protected abortion here, but that is up on the ballot on August 2nd, and that's kind of where, at least here, all eyes are going to be turning to. It's the first vote of its kind after this decision coming up. Just kind of, I know obviously this was an anticipated decision, but how does a day like this kind of set the stage for that vote?
Well, a lot of people have been anticipating this. Numerous people have talked about how this decision is going to come down sometime in late June, and then a month and a half later in the state of Kansas, you have the very first referendum, the very first political vote that has anything to do with abortion. So here in the state of Kansas, we have already been gaining a lot of money and attention and controversy coming from both anti-abortion groups and pro-abortion groups. That is simply going to ramp up. As of today, the primary election in August is important in a way that a lot of people felt it was before, but now they can experience it as a reality. The reality, as you mentioned, is that with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, there are multiple states across the country, especially states nearby Kansas, like Oklahoma and Texas and Missouri, that are prepared to put into effect pretty strict anti-abortion legislation that would not have passed constitutional muster as long as Roe v. Wade was the law of the land. Roe v. Wade is now no longer the law of the land. Those states' laws are going to go into effect. Kansas doesn't have laws like that because even though abortion is pretty strictly regulated in Kansas, it can't be banned in the way it has been or is going to be in some of these other states because of a Kansas State Supreme Court ruling. If that state Supreme Court ruling is overturned by a state constitutional amendment, then there is nothing stopping the Kansas Republican majority, the Republican majority up in Topeka, from following the same path that has been taken by many other states. And so this vote in 6 weeks is important. It was always important, but now it's important in a different way because Roe v. Wade as a backstop has been taken away.
Absolutely. And speaking of the Republicans in Topeka, I know Senate President Ty Masterson already released a statement, praising the decision today and saying now all their eyes are on that August 2nd vote and all that. Is it safe to say that that the Kansas legislature depending if the yes vote does pass in August, that they might act pretty quickly and then try to get some sort of more strict restrictions, even an all-out ban on.
If the amendment passes by anything like a clear majority, I'm talking 70% of the vote, 60% of the vote, 55% of the vote, then in such a case, I don't think there is any question whatsoever that the Republican leadership in Topeka will, as soon as possible, start drafting bills that will look very, very similar to the bills that we have seen in Texas and in Mississippi and in Oklahoma and in many other states. However, what if the amendment passes by a very, very slight majority? Let's say it passes by 50.01%, a matter of thousands of votes. Well, in that case, you're still going to have the very committed anti-abortion rights people in the Republican leadership in Topeka that will want to push forward. But will they be confident that every single member of the Republican caucus, including those in the Kansas City area or some of them here in Wichita, will go along with them? In other words, will they be confident of their supermajority if the amendment just barely squeaks through? Of course, if the amendment fails, then their whole game plan changes, because then you still have a constitutional guarantee, a state constitutional guarantee, but nonetheless a constitutional guarantee of at least some right to abortion. And as I said before, abortion in the state of Kansas is already fairly significantly regulated. But it can't be regulated in the way that some of these leading Republicans probably want it to be regulated. If the amendment doesn't pass, they're not going to be able to do it. If the amendment passes, but just barely, then they're going to have to think in terms of, will I in fact have a supermajority to support this if Governor Kelly is still in office and she vetoes it? So their attention right now is all on the constitutional amendment. Depending on how that vote goes, their attention will be entirely on the governor's race. And that'll be the same thing for Governor Kelly, because she's going to go forward and she's going to say to Democrats and moderate Republicans in Kansas, do you want to have a Texas abortion law? Do you want to have an Oklahoma abortion law? Do you want to have a Mississippi abortion law? If you don't, and you know the leaders of the Republican Party in the legislature will give one to you, then you better support me so that I can force at least a little bit of moderation upon the legislature.
That perfectly dovetails. I got two final questions for you. One of them was going to be looking forward to that governor's race if this does pass. It seems like this would become almost the topic or one of the topics of that race then, assuming that if that amendment is struck down and we are entering a phase where it's really going to be up to the pen of the governor to decide what happens.
Yes. I mean, everything about abortion that will be talked about by either Derek Schmidt or Laura Kelly is going to depend upon whether or not the constitutional amendment passes, and if it passes, how much it passes by. If the constitutional amendment passes by a significant majority, then Governor Kelly is going to be in a position of saying, okay, it's pretty clear that a lot of people in the state of Kansas, now that Roe v. Wade is gone, are interested in rethinking abortion law in the state of Kansas, and she's probably not going to want to pick major fights. But she still want to draw a distinction between saying that Kansas is going to take a moderate path as opposed to the path that's being taken by some of these more extreme states. If the amendment passes by just a tiny majority, then the onus goes over to Derek Schmidt. Is he going to go out and campaign as a Republican for governor when during a primary election vote where the electorate is much smaller, the amendment only barely makes it over the finish line? Maybe he's not going to want to talk about abortion that much. Maybe he's going to want to tell Ty Masterson and other leaders of the Republican majority in the legislature, hey, tone it down, guys. We won, let's go carefully here. And of course, if it doesn't pass at all, then Derek Schmidt's not going to want to talk about abortion whatsoever. Whereas Governor Kelly is going to want to go forward and say, Kansas has made it clear that they are not an extreme state, and she's going to be able to go forward with her usual routine of being the moderate, the non-extremist in the room. So yeah, everything that's going to happen between the Republican candidate and the Democratic candidate for the governor's race is going to change depending on what happens on August 2nd.
My final question for you is, looking back to the primary itself and simply election turnout and voter turnout. Obviously, primaries across this country typically much lower turnout than your generals.
Right.
But having an issue like this, especially in light of today, you're going to have a lot of people door knocking, campaigning on both sides probably, and with this being one of the few things on the ballot that any voter in Kansas can vote on, that's
right.
not just specifically for one party or the other. What does this turn out to energizing the bases, and what does that look like for that?
So this is going to be a really interesting political science experiment. I mean, to put on my political scientist hat, we haven't had situations with, very often throughout all of American history where something as significant as a constitutional amendment isn't on a general ballot. So we know that, generally speaking, for a lot of socioeconomic and demographic reasons, turnout just isn't as high in an August primary election. It's especially not particularly high because there are no major primary contests, no major fights for who's going to be, the Democratic or Republican nominee for governor's race. And usually those are the sorts of things that bring people out. But instead, we have a constitutional amendment. And we have a constitutional amendment fight that's taking place in the absence of any kind of federal backlog. And thus, this means it's a fight over fundamental law. I mean, you have state constitutional amendments all the time, and within the state, they mean something. But obviously, abortion is an enormity. It's huge in a way that most state constitutional provisions have nothing to do with. And so it's entirely possible that we're going to see very high levels of turnout for an August election. Maybe we won't, but it's possible we will. And of course, all sorts of people on both the anti-abortion rights and the pro-abortion rights side are trying to second guess this. They're thinking in terms of, do we actually want to motivate all of these voters? I mean, the idea that the Republican majority in Kansas had when they insisted that they wanted this amendment to be voted on in August. It could have been on the ballot in November 2020, but they deep-sixed that because they wanted it as an August election. And the reason why they wanted it as an August election was because they anticipated lower turnout. Well, they may get their wish. But now with Roe v. Wade gone and people realizing, oh wait, this is really it, this is a fundamental law decision, that may affect the number of people who come out. And so from a political science perspective, it's going to be fascinating to watch, to see if this primary election actually acts like what we expect primary elections to be, or if it ends up being something very, very different.
I'm going to get 2 shots, and then you will be out of here.
Okay.